Back at Light Trial, Xander had taken on somewhat of a fatherly role. It was entirely accidental, of course, it came naturally to him. His brother had been the leader of the Southern Scavengers for years, and the colony greatly felt his loss. Being meticulously trained by him, Xander felt it was his duty to fill that void, and the elders agreed. His promotion was bittersweet, wishing any of his family could have witnessed such a great achievement. But Anthony and Walter had been there, and they celebrated all through the night with as much bootleg and weed they could get their hands on. Those were the days. He fondly recalled the day Connor and Jenna joined the Southern Scavers. They were so young back then, only 17 and 18 respectively. Xander had only been 24 at the time and felt unprepared to take on 2 recruits. Jenna was stubborn, and hardly ever did what she was told. Connor was quiet and unconfident. Both were extremely unprepared for the wilderness. However, Xander was a patient man, and he was determined to teach them everything he knew. He mostly took to the back of them, only stepping in when they needed it or a lesson could be taught. On more than one occasion, the two had walked in the wrong direction for 2-3 miles before Xander simply asked, "Who's keeping up with the map?" Their embarrassment and extra footwork proved a well enough punishment. He loved to tell them stories, some true, some fictional. He liked to show them how to wire a bow, catch fish, tell the time, and build fires. Connor had become something of an expert at setting up camp, and it became his primary job. Jenna liked to keep the map, although she was never very good at it. Not like Walter. However, no one could ever be as good of a navigator as Walt, and that he was sure of. More often than not, Xander carried the trade, told stories, caught food, and maintained morale. But somehow, he could never shake the role of a father figure, and he was fine with that when it came to Jenna and Connor. The two often came to him with their issues, some big, and some small, all very important at the time. Connor told him about his first kiss, his dad's poor health, his annoying little sister, and everything else in between. Jenna mostly asked to hear a story or came by to tell him about a new book she was reading. Xander thought she smoked too much and he often told her to quit even though he smoked just as much as she did. Amos, on the other hand, never took to Xander. He came from a different colony that fell through. A group of 10 starving people begging for sanctuary. At his other colony, he was already a scaver, and Anthony quickly took him under his wing in the north. That seemed to be going well until Anthony announced his retirement a year ago and left Amos alone with Patty, who was already 29 and well past her prime. Xander never understood why Anthony would do such a thing, knowing damn well Amos was unfit for the role of leader. The elders, specifically Sylvia, had quickly selected 2 boys for Amos to train, though they were very timid and young. There were only 2 northern trading colonies, but still, the journey was a rough one. In Xander's personal opinion, the North Scavers couldn't hold a candle to the South, especially knowing what he now knew of Amos. The Southern Scavengers were his pride and joy, and he very much enjoyed every trip, no matter how frustrating things got. Now, all that being said, here he was on a completely different planet, with aliens that were completely foreign to him, and he felt like he was being forced back into that same fatherly role. Only this time it was not a role born of ignorance, but idiocracy, and that he could not stand. He had been content in keeping up his silent treatment and even enjoyed it at times. It felt like he could finally relax and not have to worry about being a teacher, or a leader, or what have you. Like he didn't have to watch over his back 24/7. He could just sit back and go along for the ride. Well, not anymore. The day started out poor because he failed to get any good rest the night before. He was thoroughly convinced the days on the strange planet were longer and it was fucking up his sleep schedule. The alien he now lived with was adamant in his waking, and his mood plummeted the moment he opened his eyes. Xander made sure to give him a couple of nasty glares towards his tall friend while eating his bland meal that looked a lot like oatmeal. Unfortunately, things only got worse as the day went on. Much to his dismay, he was taken back to the lab. He hated the idea of going back inside. No harm would come to him as long as he was with this alien, he was sure of that. But discomfort was not completely off the table. To make matters worse, there seemed to be an army of alien creatures standing in front of the door. They looked hungry, almost like animals stalking their prey. To his surprise, his tall companion led him directly into the meat of the crowd, and it was overwhelming, to say the least. Hands reached out from the mass in all directions, grasping at his hair, arms, legs, even his tunic. Flashes of light blinded him and he stumbled back into more hands. He had just started to panic when he was grabbed where the sun didn't shine. Finally, his patience had worn thin. That was the very last straw. He was tired and done playing nice. Seething in anger, he pushed everyone out of the way. Some out of his way got pushed too, and headed straight for the door. As his friend was opening the door, those crazy bastards tried to close it, throwing themselves in the way. Never had he seen such a brutish display. It was ridiculous. After gaining access to the lab, he actually laughed at how ridiculous the situation was, pushing grown adults out of the way like animals. It was downright stupid and uncivilized. And then, after all that, he was poked and prodded for hours by the two familiar aliens. It was torture to stay awake, but sleep was impossible with the bright light shining on his person. He was in agony. The worst part was not being able to understand what they were saying about him. He truly felt like a spectacle and was getting the idea they didn't think of him as an equal. Maybe they never did. Though he hadn't given them any reason to think he could speak, the lack of communication slowly started to disturb him. While on the table, it occurred to him that neither of them were interested in speaking to him. Sure, there was plenty of physical communication, but they rarely tried to speak with him, and it was driving him insane. At first, he appreciated the silence, but he assumed they would at least try after some time had passed. It had been 4 days since he crashed, for God's sake. The Colbu had offered him more conversation on the trade ship in 1 hour than he had gotten here in 4 fucking days. Hell, and he was cargo to the Colbu, definitely less than a person. One had even asked him which colony he came from and struck up a very weird and awkward conversation about weed. It wasn't pleasant, but it was something. He was pretty sure it was from the lack of sleep, but his usual patient self had completely fallen away that morning and was replaced with exhausted anger and frustration. He was going to have to take the reins of the situation, again. Could he not even rest for 1 moment? Was that too much to ask? He had 1 day of relaxation, one. That was all he was granted after everything he had been through that week. 1 day of false hope that he could finally relax and die peacefully on this weird planet with these weird aliens, but no. He took in a shaky breath, trying to calm himself. He knew they were probably doing their best. Truthfully, his experience hadn't been too bad up until that day. But man, that day was really, very bad. Thankfully, he kept a neutral expression throughout his seething, one of his hidden talents, and his alien friends didn't notice his change of attitude. He was glad they didn't hook him up to a machine because it would have given away his thundering heartbeat. And if they touched his neck one more time, he was going to lose his mind. He thought he and his roommate had had a special moment the night before, and he would actually understand his traumatic response and never touch him there again. But to Xander's shock, he did. The alien seemed curious as to why he would freak out over something touching his neck, not caring about the fact that he might freak out again by doing the same goddamned thing. Xander found that to be a little insulting. Well, the neck touching was not going to happen again. In fact, many things that happened that day would never happen again, and he would make sure of that. Damn sure. Stalsh, Planet Zaya, time 1500. Creature got more and more frustrated as the shun went on, and it was getting harder to study him. More than once he refused to be touched and wanted to rest on the table. Of course, that was to be expected, but it made the shun drag. Blatt too got frustrated a few times, especially when Creature stopped cooperating. They were trying hard not to push things too far after figuring out how much adrenaline he could produce. They took many breaks, giving the Creature snacks, water, and rest. Thinking back, Stalsh supposed they should have ended things sooner. He still felt like they knew next to nothing about the alien, and that bothered him. He needed to know more. It was like a persistent, annoying itch in the back of his mind. The curiosity was eating at him. Analyzing his saliva more closely proved helpful because it was a similar acidic level to that of a repsent, if not a bit more acidic. Meaning, He could probably eat anything they ate. That was a huge relief, to be sure. They would still have to be careful about what he ate, but less so than before. The social tests proved the most interesting, although they were flawed due to Creature's bad attitude. They gave him a few tools and toys to mess around with just to see what he would do with them. After one was neglected, it was replaced with something more complex. The items with moving parts proved more interesting to him. Eventually, Creature was given a puzzle with food in the middle of it. At first, the little thing seemed intrigued and inspected it thoroughly. But then after a subtle, he stopped and looked up at the two scientists with a furrowed brow. He then dropped the puzzle to the floor and refused to cooperate any further. Stalsh wondered if the behavior was simply because he was tired, or if it was something else. "He looks offended, Stalsh," Blatt said with a flat tone and dark ears. "Nonsense, why would he get offended? If he's a person, like you say, then he might be tired of us treating him like an experiment." "I know I am." He sat down in a chair while gazing at the creature. Stalsh nodded, knowing Blatt was probably right. He had never been tasked with studying a person before, and he was finding it hard not to slip into old habits. On top of that, he didn't know how much Creature cared about the situation. He was convinced he couldn't speak and relied mostly on physical communication, but it was hard to know how much he was comprehending. Blatt then looked off to the side and rose. He grabbed the radio in the room and began turning the dials. Stalsh looked at him with curiosity. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to play some music. The silence is killing me." He cycled through different frequencies at a rapid pace. Creature directed his attention there, and Stalsh picked up his journal to look over his notes. "I wonder how he'll react to the music," said Blatt. Stalsh perked up a bit. "Oh, I don't know. I hadn't thought of that." Blatt shrugged. "It always makes me feel better." He settled on a channel that was playing orchestral music. It sounded earthy with long drawn-out notes from string instruments that rose and fell gracefully. Wind pipes sang in the back, complementing the strings in harmony. Along with the ensemble of percussion, it made a very beautiful sound. "Ah, I love this music. Morania's gotten pretty good with the barian, you know." The barian was similar to a violin, only it was like two connected, with the one on the bottom having lower toned strings. You needed 4 hands to play it, 2 rubbing the bows on the 2 separate sets of strings, and the other 2 holding down the strings at the top of each neck. Stalsh's ears turned pink and he trilled. "Really? That's great, it's been a while since I heard her play." Blatt set the radio down on the counter and pointed it at Creature. "She has a concert coming up for school. I'll have to invite you." Stalsh put down his journal. "Oh, you don't have to do that, I know that's kinda private." "No," he shook his head. "I want you to go. You're my friend, right?" Stalsh's ears perked and bounced with a pink hue. He smiled softly and looked at Blatt. "Well, thank you. I really appreciate it." His attention was grabbed to the center of the room. On the table, Creature crossed his legs and closed his eyes, propping his head up on an arm. He exhaled, relaxed his body, and opened his mouth wide, making a low tone. Stalsh had come to realize that meant he was tired. "You think he likes it?" "Hard to say." Blatt stood up and walked over to the table. Creature looked up at him and sighed. "I guess he's not so bad." He crossed his upper arms and leaned on the table with the bottom too, peering at the little thing before him. Creature's hair was a dark brown, soft, shaggy, and unkempt. The bottom of his face was covered in a coarse thin layer of hair that had grown in the shuns since he crashed. He's cute, in an ugly way. Since Creature had decided he was done being studied, Stalsh decided to take him home. They would need to visit Amridge in the morning, which meant Creature would need to stay with Nyam for the shun. They both agreed that keeping him alone in the lab was a bad idea for a few reasons. Blatt was slightly uncomfortable with it, but ultimately agreed as long as Nyam could use a sedative in any emergency. The writers had thankfully gotten all the scene saves they wanted for the day and had left, making their exit a lot more palatable. When Stalsh and Creature got back home, they were both utterly exhausted. Creature still refused to be touched and pushed Stalsh away if he even tried to hold his hand. He made a beeline for the mattress as soon as he walked through the door, curling up under the blankets and sighing hard. He had a rough day, and Stalsh realized long before that point that Creature was cross with him. His sour attitude was mainly directed at him, it seemed. Maybe spending a shun apart was a good idea after all. He slept on the couch that night, for both their sake. Upvote 108 downvote 11 go to comments share.